I'm going to be talking about VSAN. Maybe some of you have already seen some of the announcements that were made at VMworld around VSAN 6.5. But most of my session is actually going to be about the VSAN futures. So what are we working towards? What are we working on as it stands today? And what are we aiming to solve? Now, if you look at the world of IT today, I think we have a couple of big problems. A lot of these problems tend to be around data and how we manage data and where we store that data. The big challenge that we have is the amount of data growth that we are seeing in the average data center today. So by average, we expect a data growth of about, or at least the data doubling every 2 years. So you can imagine in your current data center today, if you have 100 terabytes worth of storage as it stands right now, you will need 200 terabytes of storage 2 years from now. So that also means that from a challenges perspective, the way you're managing your data center, the way you're managing your storage, things will need to change. You can't manage them in the same way when they start exploding like this, when they start growing like this. So I think there's a lot of challenges, and with VSAN, we're aiming to start solving those problems. But the first question is if you look at all of the data, where is the data landing? Traditionally, I'm pretty sure that most of you guys are EMC customers, NetApp customers, HP and IBM. But are those still the platforms of the future? Are those traditional storage arrays that will force you to create LUNs, create data stores, still the platform that you will be using for all of this data that's now starting to evolve, emerge? Well, if you look at this research, and this is a research that was done by Wikibon, they started to analyze the different trends within the industry. And there's a clear trend here. If you look at the red section, that's traditional storage systems, so the EMCs, NetApps, IBM, HPs of the world, probably what you guys are using today. If you look at the red line, that's where we are today, and then there's a blue section at the bottom, and there's a green section at the top right. The green section is hyperscale service and storage solutions. So what are we talking about this? Well, hyperscale service and storage solutions are S3 type of storage solutions, object storage solutions, but also, for instance, things like Cassandra databases, so Cassandra clusters. This is where we see a lot of the data going towards, and the key reason for that is big data. So a lot of customers, a lot of companies are actually right now analyzing a lot of data they are getting in by leveraging these new platforms. Those types of different data sets don't land on traditional storage because it's too complicated to manage in the first place. Second of all, it's too expensive, which is probably the most important part. Now there's a second new storage system out there as well. I've already spoke about VSAN, and VSAN actually fits in that blue portion of this graph. And I think it clearly shows that we'll see a rapid growth in the hyperconverged space. That's not just VSAN, of course, there's many other players in this space as well. And I know there's a couple of them actually at the solutions section. So if you're out there today, make sure to look at those options as well. But there's a clear growth, and there's a reason for it. The reason for it is if you look at the traditional storage systems out there today is that they don't meet the requirements that most of you will have when it comes to deploying new applications and managing data at this volume. If we're talking about petabytes worth of data, you don't want to create 5,000 LUNs or 10,000 LUNs or maybe even 100,000 LUNs to deploy your virtual machines, to have Docker containers running on top of those systems. You need to be capable of actually managing that in a really, really simple way. And if you look at hyperconverged, that's exactly what hyperconverged is doing. Right? Hyperconverged is a different way of managing the same thing, more or less, because it's a different kind of beast. It's typically a scale-out solution, and it allows you to combine SSDs and spindle, add them to hosts, and manage them as a single entity. So it's a different way of managing more or less the same thing. In the end, it's still the same thing, right? We're still storing virtual machines, we're still storing data sets, but we're doing that in a bit of a smarter way. Now, of course, as VMware, we also have an offering in that space. I've spoken about that, I think, 2 years in a row, which is VSAN. Hopefully, by now, all of you are familiar with what VSAN is. If you're not, I'm going to go over it try to cover it in a couple of minutes, and then we'll start talking about what's new and what's coming up in the future. Well, VSAN is a hyperconverged enabler. It's not a hyperconverged system per se, as we're not actually delivering VSAN together with a piece of hardware. But there are many companies doing that. EMC, for instance, or Dell EMC, I should say right now, is doing that. So they have VxRail, which combines vSAN, vSphere, and some other tool sets, and deliver that as a single package. And what we do, if you look at the solution that's up here right now, if you look at vSAN itself, what we simply do is we grab all of the local resources and share those out as a single data store. So what does that mean? Well, right now in your data center, if you deploy a virtual machine, before you deploy a virtual machine, you need to figure out where the virtual machine lands. So you need to figure out which data store to use or which LUN to use. Is that LUN replicated? Is it deduplicated? Maybe it's compressed, maybe it's thin provision. There could be synchronous or asynchronous replication enabled, you name it. There are many different options that you have. With vSAN, that's not the case. Everything with vSAN around policy-based management. And I think that's the most important part. Now, when it comes to deploying vSAN, and I've mentioned this a couple of times already, there are many different use cases. I don't know, are there any vSAN customers in the room today? That's surprisingly little. So we need to talk. I need to talk with each one of you after the session to convince you to go towards vSAN. Because whenever I asked a question, I was just at the VMware in Iceland, and even in Iceland, when you only have 300,000 people, there were in the room of 50 people, there were about 5 or 10 already using vSAN. So you guys need to get up to speed, and I'm hoping after this session you will start moving towards vSAN. But if you look at the customer base that we have today, we have many different customers. So we have customers ranging from large financial institutions to small, accountancy companies with maybe 10 or 15 servers. So small, relatively small environments. I'm talking about virtual servers in this case as well. So we have customers all over the place, and they use it for many different reasons. The challenging part with vSAN is typically explaining these use cases to storage administrators. Are there any storage administrators in the room? Before I pick a fight, I need to know how many people actually would want to fight me. So let's go. If you look at these different use cases, it's always challenging to explain a storage administrator why it's useful to have a different type of storage system in their environment, something that they are not responsible for. Well, you can imagine that if you have a larger environment, you have many virtual machines, you have many different hosts, you have a lot of management tools as well. What most of my customers end up doing is running the management tools, including the storage management tools, on top of the same virtual environment, running on top of the same storage system. So you can imagine if that storage system fails, all of the management tools that you had for that particular storage system are now gone as well. But it's a great use case for virtual SAN. If you have a management cluster, I would highly recommend you to start looking at virtual SAN and introduce virtual SAN in that particular environment. Because now you can run those management tools for your storage system on top of virtual SAN and not have that dependency anymore. If your storage system fails for whatever reason, you will still have your tooling available to figure out what has happened and how to repair the issue as well. The other one that I think is probably one of the best examples is a DMZ environment. I have a lot of customers that have a large web front end, and one of the best example is a customer I recently spoke with in South Africa, and they have about 500 to 600 different web servers, and all of those web servers run on top of their production storage systems. Yes, they are fully isolated, they have their own SAN segment, you name it, but they still end up using the same spindles. So what happened in their case, they had a denial of service attack. There were probably 1 million, 2 million connections being created every single minute to their web servers, and it actually brought down not only their web servers, but also their storage systems. Why? Well, their storage system wasn't capable of doing any type of quality of service. So the full environment went down. And you can imagine that when it's just your web front end, you have a challenge. But when it's also your production databases, when it's Exchange, when it's everything you have running for that particular company, you have a big challenge. So what they ended up doing is they ended up migrating their whole web farm over to vSAN, fully isolated environment. And even if it's under attack right now and vSAN wouldn't be able to cope with the amount of IOPS that's being driven, it wouldn't impact the rest of the environment. Now, I think I've shown a similar slide last year, and last year we were probably at around 2,500, 2,000 customers, maybe even less when I was here. But as it stands right now, we're up to 5,500 customers, and it's probably higher because this is a slide that was created before VMworld. So we add a couple of hundred customers actually every week when it comes to vSAN. So the numbers are quite significant. Actually, if you look at the numbers, we are the #1 player when it comes to hyperconverged infrastructure out there. It's deployed in many different countries, but more importantly, it's typically used for critical apps, so business critical apps. When we just saw the use cases, I spoke about DMZ and a management cluster, which is just 2 examples. majority of our customers are actually doing business critical apps on top of vSAN. With that meaning SQL databases, Exchange, anything you would like to run. So now that we covered some of the basics, what is vSAN really about, right? It's not about serving up storage, but it's about managing the environment in a specific way. And in particular, it's about offering simplicity to you as an IT administrator, but also to the business. Now, if you look at vSAN, hopefully most of you are familiar with the web client. I'm not going to spend much time on the web client because I know that's always becomes a heated debate. But everything you would like to do from a storage perspective, from a vSAN perspective, is available within the web client as it stands today. Enabling vSAN maybe is around 8 to 9 clicks. Last time I was here, it probably was still 2 clicks. We added a lot of functionality, so there's a couple of new extra choices that need to be made, but it's fairly straightforward. Besides enabling it simple, also managing it is relatively simple. So we have a health check functionality, for instance, and a health check functionality literally tells you what's going on in your environment. Is multicast enabled? How is your network behaving? If you have a stretched cluster, what's the latency between the two sites? If anything is happening to an SSD, we'll tell you what's happening with the SSD. But also other things. For instance, the performance data is all available within the web client itself. How is my disk behaving? What is my SSD doing? What is my disk group doing? How is the virtual machine doing? How is the cluster doing? All of that data is available within the web client. On top of that, of course, we also provide a lot of capacity data. So how many virtual machines do I have stored? How much data do they take? Or how much capacity do they consume? But also, for instance, what's the total capacity of the swap files? So if you have many virtual machines, you'll also have many swap files. What's the cost of the swap file itself? We'll also provide you that kind of data. So very granular, useful information. But when it comes to it, I think this is one of the most important things, right? It's cool that you can enable it in 5 seconds. It's great that you can see all of the information, but in the end, it's all about deploying virtual machines. And I've already mentioned that briefly. When it comes to deploying virtual machines, when it comes to virtual SAN, I think this is the key thing: storage policy-based management. Now, within vSphere, we've offered storage policy-based management for a long time. Ever since we introduced storage DRS and storage I/O control, we also had this option around storage policy-based management. The challenge that we had with it is that it wasn't really useful so far. It became useful with virtual SAN and now with virtual volumes as well. Instead of creating many different LUNs and having a long spreadsheet that describes which LUN has what enabled, within a policy, you can now define what should be enabled for a particular virtual machine. So that means if you have a particular virtual machine that needs to have, for instance, 3 copies of the data, you specify that in a policy and assign that policy to that particular virtual machine. That also means that, let's assume you have 50 web servers, and you would like to have 1 copy of the data available for those particular 50 web servers, and you want to make changes at some point in time because the business requires you to make those changes. You don't need to pick up those virtual machines and move them to a different data store. No, the only thing you need to do is change that policy or apply a new policy to those virtual machines. By one simple change, vSAN will realize that something has changed for those particular virtual machines and actually make the changes at the back end. So we'll start creating additional copies of your data without you actually doing anything around that besides changing that policy. Well, you can imagine that changing a policy maybe takes 10, 15 seconds. Moving 50, 60 virtual machines around to a different LUN takes a lot more time. So that's what the true value is of virtual SAN, policy-based management. So hopefully that is clear. And when it comes to policy-based management, this is actually what happens. So at the back end, vSAN is what we call an object-based storage system. And basically what happens is when you create a particular policy and when you assign a particular policy, the data will be laid out across the data center in a particular way, depending on how you've defined that. So what does that mean? Well, in this scenario, you'll see a VMDK at the top with 2 RAID sets, a RAID 1 set and a RAID 0 set, and you see this witness thing at the bottom. What's important here to realize here is that the RAID 1 set more or less defines how many copies of the data that we have. So in this case, we'll have 2 copies of the data, which means that within the policy we've said, we like to be able to tolerate one host failure. The striping is usually done for a performance reason. So within the policy itself, you can also define what type of performance capabilities or characteristics you would like to have for that particular virtual machine or group of virtual machines. And if you've defined that, we'll make sure that we'll start striping the data across hosts, across disk groups, across disks. All of that is possible within VSAN. It's fairly straightforward. It's not something that you need to remember, but it's good to understand that we have that capability within VSAN. I'm not sure if I presented on, I don't think I presented on 6.2 here, so I'm just going to show this functionality around 6.2 and then we'll move towards 6.5. Within 6.2 we introduced some useful features in my opinion. First of all, deduplication and compression. I don't need to explain what it is. I think what's good to know from our perspective is that it's near what we call near-line dedupe and compression. That basically means that we will absorb all of the reads into persistent storage first, then we'll dedupe and compress it, and then we'll store it in the capacity layer. Key reason for doing that is that if we would absorb all of your writes into memory first and then dedupe and compress it, right? If there's some form of power loss, we could potentially lose data as well. So that's the reason we write it to an SSD first. Secondly, the other thing that we introduced, RAID 5 and RAID 6 over the network. Doesn't sound too spectacular, but it is good to understand that from an overhead perspective. Right now, if you would pick 2 copies of the data, you will have 2 full copies of the data, which means that there's a 100% overhead. If you use something like RAID 5 or RAID 6, there's only a 33% overhead or a 50% overhead. So there's a capacity savings here. This only works for all flash, by the way. The other thing that I wanted to briefly talk about is the availability aspect of VSAN. I've already mentioned the multiple copies of the data that you can have. I also want to mention that you're fully capable of, for instance, explaining to VSAN what the data center looks like. So what does that mean? Well, you can imagine that you have multiple racks in your data center. A rack could be considered as a fault domain. Within the VSAN UI, you can actually specify what those fault domains are. So you can specify that you have 4 racks with 8 hosts across those racks. And when we actually start creating those objects for those virtual machines, we'll make sure that we actually spread the data across those racks instead of having it all within that particular rack. So if that particular rack fails, you still have your data available. We could do the same thing from a site perspective. So within VSAN, you can also specify that you have multiple sites. So if you want to create a stretched cluster across multiple sites, then you can actually do so within VSAN. And that takes about 10 or 15 clicks. Fairly straightforward, especially if you compare that to the traditional stretched clustering environments out there. Last but not least, of course, we're also capable of leveraging, for instance, vSphere replication with a 5-minute RPO and actually replicate the data to a third site. So even if you use the stretched clustering feature, you can also replicate the data to another site. So what have we just announced in 6.5? Well, first of all, the iSCSI services. A lot of questions that people had with VSAN is around exposing VSAN storage to other types of solutions. Usually people want to expose it to either physical or third-party hypervisors or solutions like that, and that is something that we're actually targeting with the iSCSI solution. In the first release, it's targeted at Oracle RAC and physical workloads, so you're capable of actually creating an iSCSI LUN and then actually exposing that to an external system. But what we're also aiming for in the future is enable this, for instance, for Microsoft clustering services or for third-party hypervisors like Hyper-V if you're running that in your environment. So you could even use vSAN storage for that if you want to. The great thing about this is that all of the different data services that we just spoke about, RAID 5, RAID 6, RAID 1, striping, dedupe and compression, all of that still works with iSCSI as well. So when you create a LUN, you assign a policy to it, right? And if you need to have changes made to that particular LUN, you just change the policy. So they're all objects at the back end. The question that then typically comes in, okay, we already have an iSCSI solution. How difficult is it? Well, there are only 3 screens when it comes to iSCSI, so it's fairly straightforward. Within the vSphere web client, you enable it, and then the only thing you need to do is create a target, and on top of that, you create a LUN. So you create an iSCSI target, which is basically the whole vSAN cluster. There are IP addresses assigned to that vSAN cluster for iSCSI as well. And then you end up monitoring the iSCSI LUNs. So fairly straightforward, only 3 steps needed when it comes to creating an iSCSI solution. The other question I think this is one of the questions I had here last year after this session. I had a discussion with someone about robo solutions, and two-node robo solutions in particular. If it was possible to actually not use a 10 gig switch. As most of you know, for vSAN, we more or less have the recommendation out there to use a 10 gig switch, which means that in smaller sites with only 2 nodes, for instance, it becomes really expensive. So what we'll allow you to do within vSphere or VSAN 6.5, which is vSphere 6.5 as well, is to create multiple VM kernel interfaces and have those NICs assigned to those VM kernel interfaces and directly connect those NICs to each other, just using an Ethernet cable. So not having to use that particular 10 gig switch anymore, which should also reduce the cost significantly. I have a lot of customers that are interested in this, especially those with many different locations across Europe or across the world, potentially even. The other thing, of course, that we've been working on is probably not the most interesting thing, considering we're talking about software-defined storage, but of course is the hardware aspect. We've been working on enabling 512E drives, so those are different form factor drives. We don't have support for 4K native yet, but as soon as vSphere will support 4K native, we'll support 4K native as well. But what we've been working on is enabling these newer types of technologies, and there's a good reason for it. If you look at the world as it stands today, this is more or less what it looked like yesterday or last week or maybe even last year. Disk, of course, is still the cheapest out there, or was the cheapest out there, I should say, and then you had SSD, NVMe, and then, of course, memory. But if you look at the world out today, it's fast, it's changing extremely fast. SSD more or less comes at the same price as it stands today as those spindles. I know I had the discussion here last year, about the price of flash, and many people were saying, well, the price of flash is still relatively high, and that's true. The price of flash was still relatively high last year, but it has dropped. If you look at the Dell website, HP, you name it, look at those prices today, you will see that the price of flash is roughly around the same price as the price of spindles. Of course, depending on the type of flash that you're buying. Now, when you deploy vSAN, you need to have 2 types of flash. One being used as a write buffer, the other one is being used as a capacity layer. For the capacity layer, you can typically use the cheaper types of flash, which is read-intensive flash. And you will see that those will typically come in around the €1 per gig mark. More importantly, also the NVMe devices are dropping in terms of prices, and I have a lot of customers actually starting to look at that as well for really high-performing performance environments, low latency environments. We have customers doing all NVMe environments. So here we're talking about being capable of driving 200, 300,000 IOPS per host in a cluster. So if you have 16 hosts, you can do the math. I have another customer who's also working with a new type of NVMe device, and they're actually capable of driving 1 million IOPS with 90 microseconds from a single host. And they are planning on doing 16 hosts in one cluster. So you can imagine what type of workloads those clusters are capable of running. So those changes, I think, are great to realize, but there's one thing that was missing, at least from my perspective. And I think this is one of the changes that we made, which has nothing to do with technology itself per se, but it is really important. This is something that Cormac and I have been driving within our business unit. If you looked at the way that we licensed vSAN, the all-flash functionality for vSAN was only part of the advanced licensing SKU. One of the things that we said to our team is that, well, it's great that we have a software-defined storage solution, but you can't license a software-defined storage solution based on hardware. So the change that we introduced is we actually dropped that all-flash down from advanced to standard, which means that every single vSAN customer doesn't have to pay a premium to run flash hardware. So I think that is a great change. This also goes for 6.5 or for 6.2 customers, by the way. If you have the 6.5 license, you can actually downgrade to 6.2 and use all flash, I've been told, in those environments. So I think it's a great solution. But that's what we have out there today. Let's have a look at what we're working towards as it stands, because there's many different things that we're working towards. Now keep in mind that this is, well, it's not under NDA, but this is stuff that we're still developing. So some of these things may or not may be delivered. I don't know. This is something that we're working on. This is something that we're working towards. This is something that we're thinking about. It's all brand new. Some of this is actually not being developed actively right now. It's just being planned for. So if you look at the announcements that we have planned for vSAN, they evolve around three key pillars, I would say. First of all, management and monitoring. I think it's already that simple to manage vSAN, but we're going to make it even more simpler. We're also going to make it more simpler to deploy vSAN. On top of that, we're working towards even a more highly available system and a more secure system as well. And we're doing something in the data management / mobility space. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at some of these features a bit more in depth. Before I do so, there's a beta that is more, well, it's about to start running. I think you can still sign up for the beta, but there are 3 features that we have enabled in this beta. And let's look at those first. Are any of you using Stretch cluster environments? Anyone doing EMC VPlex, Metro clustering? A couple of people, okay. So we already introduced the Stretch clustering functionality within vSAN, which was great because you had 2 copies of the data in 2 different locations. Now, if you look at the traditional Stretch clustering systems, what they typically have is they'll have local protection and they'll have a copy across sites. That was the one thing that we were missing. We had 2 copies, one in both sites, but we didn't go across sites. And that's something that we're working on for this particular beta. So for the upcoming beta, what we'll allow you to do is both specify that you would like to have copies across sites, but also specify what the protection within a site should be. So even if a full site fails, you'll still have local protection. So you can have a full site failure and then even have local hosts failing as well and still have your data available. On top of that, what this also allows us to do is if you have a local site failure and one of the virtual machines is impacted and one of those objects disappears, we can start repairing it locally as well, which means that we don't need to traverse the network to repair your data, which from a data center perspective is something that we should have always aimed for. But this is something that we'll be releasing with the beta. Hopefully, depending on your feedback, it will make the GA as well at that point in time. The other thing that we're working on is encryption at rest for vSAN. Now, we've just introduced VM encryption with vSphere 6.5, so a lot of you may be wondering, why are we doing this? Because we already have that in the vSphere platform. Well, the encryption that's part of 6.5 is a great solution, but the challenge with encryption in 6.5 for vSphere is that it happens all the way at the top, which means that if you're an all-flash customer and you would like to do deduplication and compression, the encryption actually prevents you from deduplicating those pages because all of the blocks will be encrypted first, then they would be deduplicated. Typically when encryption happens, there's very little chances you'll be able of deduplicating it. So we're introducing a new encryption mechanism that will actually happen all the way down at the SSD level or at the spindle level, depending on what type of environment you're running, which basically means that we'll be deduplicating the blocks first, we'll be compressing it, then we'll be encrypting the data and storing it safely. So it's a new mechanism that we'll be introducing for this particular beta as well. But that's just around the corner. There's also a lot of more stuff that we're working on, and that's something that I want to cover right now as well. First of all, I know many customers are starting to look at hybrid cloud solutions, so potentially deploying workloads in the Google Cloud, for instance, or Azure, or Amazon. But if you start doing that, what happens to your data? Who owns the data? Who manages the data? Who ensures that you have multiple copies of your data, that it's backed up correctly for compliancy reasons, you name it. Those are some of the challenges people are faced with right now, and I know a lot of companies haven't actually thought about that yet. I was talking to a large company who has this big DR solution created for the local data center, but they have nothing for the solution that sits out in Amazon. Actually, they're not even backing it up. So God knows what happens when Amazon blows up, and then that can potentially happen, of course. So we are working towards having solutions around that as well. So from a policy-based management perspective, what we're aiming to do is actually extending the policy set that you have available as it stands right now, extending that to include data management as well. Not just from a compliancy perspective, but from a DR perspective, but also from a backup point of view. So how many copies of the data would you like to have in your backup? What should be the retention period of that? Where does it need to be stored? If your data is located right now, if you have a cloud solution in Europe, would you like to store the data somewhere else? Do they need to be in the same data centers? Do they need to be in different data centers? That's what we are working towards. From us in particular, that also means that from a vSAN standpoint, we need to start changing the architecture slightly. If you look at vSAN as it stands right now, we still more or less have the same snapshot mechanism you guys are using today, although we use vSAN snapshots and they're slightly more performing than the vSphere snapshots. I think it's fair to say that they're not at the level that you expect them to be, especially not if you compare them to traditional storage snapshots. So what we're planning on doing is introducing a new snapshotting mechanism where we actually allow you to create potentially up to 100 snapshots per virtual machine and actually store those snapshots persistently as well, both locally, but also across locations, across storage solutions on top of that. So you can imagine you have your current vSAN cluster, you create an X number of snapshots per day. Some of those snapshots may be offloaded to a second site, some of those snapshots may be offloaded to a third site. All of that driven by policy. So within that policy, you'll define how many copies of the data you would like to have and where they potentially need to be stored. So all of that will be made available within vSAN at some point in time. And I think this is something that will set aside vSAN compared to all of the other solutions out in the market as it stands right now. The other thing that we'll be working towards is making it even easier to start deploying vSAN. If you look at the solutions that we have out there today, even the hyperconverged solutions that are out there today, you still end up being responsible typically for driver management, firmware management, updates, and you name it. I don't know, how many people enjoy updating firmware or drivers? Hey, there's one person that enjoys it too. We're probably looking for someone to manage our lab, so I need to talk to you guys afterwards. Just imagine you have 5,000 hosts. There's a new driver being released in combination with a new level of firmware. How do you update that? It's fairly painful as it stands right now because you need to use 2 or 3 different tools to actually do that, to do those particular updates. So what we're working towards is actually including all of that logic within Update Manager. So within vSphere Update Manager, you can now update the firmware and the drivers as well, which sounds like something really simple, but it's going to save you a lot of time. For those who haven't seen it, by the way, Update Manager has also become part of the vCenter appliance. So if you prefer to use the vCenter appliance, Update Manager will come included as part of that. The other thing that we're working on is starting to include more useful data within the health check, right? Things like smart, how is my SSD device doing? Is there any particular wear out? Do we need to start changing SSDs? All of that information will start exposing within the health check. On top of that, there's a real dependency on vCenter as it comes right now. So what we're also aiming to do is expose that kind of data through the UI, but then on a host level. So we already have the HTML5 host client. I don't know if people have seen it or not. If you haven't seen it, look at it. But we'll start exposing some of the data in that client as well, so you can start monitoring the environment even when vCenter is not available. Last but not least, and some of this has already been released, but we're starting to expose more and more data into VROps and allow you to use policy-based management within vRealize automation on top of that. So if you use vRealize automation and you like to use the same policies you have available within vCenter, you can start doing that as well. And you can imagine that when we have this amount of data, the smart data, the driver data, and you name it, that we should also be capable of doing smarter things with the data. Especially when it comes to vSAN, I think, especially when it comes to any storage system, I think it's really important that your data is highly available. And as it stands today, it's really difficult for us to actually monitor or see what's going on within the different sites. So what we're aiming to build is an analytics platform based on the phone home system that's already part of vSphere. So we're just extending that functionality and actually bring data back into our data centers. We'll be anonymous as well. We'll explain to you what kind of data will be exposed, and it's an opt-in program. So if you don't like to expose the data, you don't need to expose that. But we should be able to actually grab that data and then start correlating the different issues that we are seeing. You can imagine that if 15 or 20 or 30 different customers with the same type of hardware are experiencing the same type of issue, we should be able to inform other customers about that as well and potentially already provide them a solution for the problem at the same time. So that is something that we're working towards, and I think it's something that a lot of customers will start finding very valuable. I'm not going to talk about cloud native because I realize most of the guys were still sleeping from the previous 2 sessions about containers, so I don't want to bring back that pain again. But I do think that from a storage perspective, there is something more to talk about. Because when we have these new different types of workloads, there will also need to be a different type of way of managing those workloads. Cormac has already explained the different projects that are going on within VMware. So we have the Docker volume driver, for instance. You can already use vSAN as a data store, but the challenge you'll have with that today is that vSAN was built for virtual machines. It wasn't necessarily built for Docker instances. It wasn't created for containers per se. Yeah, sure, we can create clones, we can create snapshots, but if you want to create 1,000 snapshots of a particular photon machine in this case, or a Docker container, whatever it ends up being, vSAN is probably not the platform for it. So what we're doing in-house right now is actually building a new file system, and that file system will allow you to create 1,000 snapshots or 1,000 clones of any particular instance within a second. That means that if you're running a large web farm environment, and for whatever reason traffic is spiking, you need to have 500 additional web servers, you'll be able to create those literally within seconds and expose those to the outside world as well. That is something that we're working on. And you can also imagine that if we have this really fast and agile file system out there, we can start exposing it in other ways as well, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, I've spoken about the vSAN future part for the last 20-25 minutes, and I think these are the key things that we are focusing on. We're aiming to build the best storage platform out there for different types of workloads in a cross-cloud architecture, whether that's containers, whether that's regular virtual machines, and whether they need to have some form of data protection enabled, backup, data recovery, or any form of encryption. All of that should be possible with vSAN within the vSphere environment. And we'll make sure that will be possible. More importantly, if you look at this diagram, I think this is where we've already more or less landed. One of the things that we still do not have is the middle section, or actually the section right underneath those virtual machines. On the left side, you'll see VMware and block. Well, those two we've just delivered. So we have this iSCSI interface to vSAN available already. VMware is just the data store that vSAN provides to you. We have that available as well. The two things that are missing as it stands today are file and rest. Well, I just spoke about that distributed file system that allows you to deploy many different containers within seconds. Well, that's just a distributed file system, as I said. And you can imagine we can also expose those through something like an S3 interface, so your developers can use that to create whatever they want to create on top of that particular data store. Or your administrators can use that, for instance, to connect it to a backup solution like Veeam. All of that should be possible. And of course, the file interface, last but not least, if you want to replace a particular filer solution, you need to have that capability available. All of that should be available through vSAN as well. And with that, we reached the end of my session. I think I'm in time, so I'm going to hand over to Joe and Amanda, who are going to talk more about the VMware strategy in general and in a broader sense. Joe?